Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We took last week off as the news has slowed down a little bit with IU basketball here, 4 months removed from the last game. But we figured we'd change it up a little bit this week and open up the reader mailbag. I've got Cameron Drummond of Inside the Hall, who also, I believe, is searching for full-time employment. So if you're hiring, please contact Cam. He's looking for a job, preferably one in journalism. But he's with me this week to kind of tackle these mailbag questions. Welcome back to Podcast on the Brink, Cam. We're happy to have you with us.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be on. And yes, I am looking for work. So find me on Twitter. My email's there. I'll do anything. If you need a lawn mowed in the Dallas, Texas area in the next 3 to 4 weeks, I can help out with that as well. But yeah, good to be back. Good to talk some IU hoops, even though there's maybe not a ton of shifting things on the front just because of, kind of gestures at the world around us right now.
So for the mailbag, for those who haven't listened to an episode before, we take questions from the premium forum on Inside the Hall and got a lot of submissions this week. So I kind of try to group these the best I can in terms of topic. Not sure that we'll get to all of them, but we're gonna start off the top with a little recruiting discussion. IU Hoops 22 asks, so why hasn't Trey Kaufman committed? Seems like a no-brainer. Archie has worked the state effectively, and this kid is from Southern Indiana and a perfect fit. So, Cam, I'll speak a little bit on this first, and you can chime in if you want. I think right now, and if you've listened to our episodes of Podcast on the Brink this offseason, we had Corey Evans of Rivals on at one point, tried to talk as much recruiting as we can. But I think the circumstances right now with obviously the COVID-19 pandemic have changed the recruitment process for certain guys and maybe slowed down the process for some guys, and it's also sped up the process for other guys. You noticed, Trey Patterson, a guy that Indiana recruited pretty heavily, he went ahead and made his decision in June, really without taking official visits. He took some as a junior, but didn't take, obviously, his senior year official visits that he would be allotted, because right now you can't take those based on NCAA rules. Same thing coming up later this week. Jordan Longino is going to announce his decision, I believe, Thursday night at some point. I believe around 7 or 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. So he's going to go ahead and he's never visited Indiana, but he's going to go ahead and make his decision as well. So there are a lot of guys that are going ahead and making their commitments. On the flip side of that, there's guys who are waiting, I think, to see what happens with campus visits and timelines in terms of when they can get back on campus. I wouldn't expect that to be the case anytime soon. But I think the longer this goes on with guys not being able to visit anywhere, in a case like a player like Trey Kaufman, it favors a school like Indiana, who has obviously hosted him for numerous visits, who he's familiar with, a school that's recruited him very hard. And so I wouldn't get too worried at this point that he hasn't made a decision. I wouldn't view that in any way as negative for Indiana at this point. I just think that different circumstances right now kind of lead people to take different approaches. And Trey Kaufman, he knows the Indiana offer is going to be there for him whenever he does want to make his decision. It's not going to change Indiana's pursuit of him. And so I just think he's probably one of those guys who's more in the camp of let's wait and see what happens. Am I going to be able to take some visits? I want to take my time. I want to make sure that I'm making the best decision for me. So I haven't read really too much into the fact that he's taken a little bit maybe longer than some of these other guys. Cam, your thoughts on, you've talked to a lot of recruiting targets lately, some in 2021, others in 2022 and beyond. But I think it's fair to say that different guys are taking a different approach to this kind of just based on their circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like recruiting in normal times as well. Each things are different for each player. You know, some guys prioritize staying home more than other players. Other players prioritize the coaching staff or the environment of a school. And, you know, especially in the middle of a global pandemic, your priorities maybe kind of shift and you're a bit more hesitant to make a snap decision. And, you know, that's probably the case with Kaufman. There's been a couple of stories about him. You know, he's kind of getting back into playing basketball with Indiana Elite and some of the AAU stuff that they're allowed to have up in Grand. And Kyle Neenrep from the Indy Star talked to him quite recently, in fact, and kind of focused on the angle of it being an IU versus Purdue recruiting battle. But Trey was quick to remind him as well that, you know, Louisville is very close to Sellersburg, where, you know, he kind of plays for Silvers Creek, and Xavier's, you know, kind of sort of close by as well, so they're kind of in the hunt. He mentioned also some recent offers he's picked up from schools like Clemson, Texas A&M, Wake Forest, that he really wants to maybe take a couple more official visits before committing, and those were schools that he wasn't even giving a look at before the pandemic because he didn't have the offers from them. And he had the specific line with relation to Indiana toward the end of the piece, and he said, quote, "I think with IU, there's not a lot of recruiting left. It's more of deciding if this is the right fit or the perfect fit for me, So when you kind of read into that, you get the sense that maybe he knows what Indiana has to offer. He's obviously been recruited by Archie and Tom Ostrom for a long while now, and may even be at the point with him where he just wants to kind of eliminate other schools before committing to one specific school. And as you mentioned, the lack of on-campus recruiting, in-person visits definitely slows down that process for him. So I wouldn't read too much into it at all. And as you mentioned, I've talked to a lot of recruiting targets recently as well for stories with Inside the Hall. And it's just so different for each kid right now, especially based on which part of the country they're in, whether they're able to get in any AAU or EYBL games, what their high school practice regimen is like. So I'm kind of in the camp with you. I wouldn't read too much into it all, the fact that he's maybe taken a step back from everything. And he took like a 2-week vacation in the summer as well. So he's really just starting to maybe shift his mind back on the basketball as whatever kind of a school year is going to unfold takes shape in Indiana now.
Got one more recruiting question before we kind of change gears. And TJ21 in the forum writes that he's heard talk of Indiana not wanting to take both Trey Kaufman and Mason Miller. He says, if we can get Kaufman and Miller, I would take both. Do you agree with this? And if you don't, why? And then he also asks for a percentage chance of this happening, which I'm terrible with a percentage chance. I will go on the record saying that I think Indiana's got as good a chance as anybody for Trey Kaufman. Mason Miller, not as familiar with his recruitment. Obviously, we have done a couple stories, but I just don't have the background knowledge on that one. I do know that Indiana's really recruiting him hard, and there's the relationship there that's built in between Tom Ostrom, who's Indiana's associate head coach. Some may know this, some may not. You know, Mason Miller, obviously the son of former Florida standout, former NBA player Mike Miller, who was an assistant coach at Memphis. And Tom Ostrom was just getting his start in college basketball coaching, I believe as an administrative assistant and then later a video coordinator at Florida when Mike Miller was a player on their team that went to the 2000 national championship game, eventually lost to Michigan State. Side note, I was at that game as a young 18-year-old sitting in the upper level. I think that was actually the last Final Four that I went to. But anyway, not to get off topic here, but TJ, I would say, and this is my opinion, I think if Indiana can get both, they will take both. I see no reason why they would not. I don't see any reason why those two guys couldn't play together other than if one of them had an objection in terms of minutes or role, but I don't foresee that being a problem. Both seem to be versatile enough to kind of share the court together. And you know, Trey Kaufman is a no doubt top 50 player. Mason Miller, I believe, ranked in the same kind of range there, top 50, top 75, I believe. I don't have the rankings in front of me. So I don't think would be any hesitation for Indiana to take both of those guys. And I think it would be pretty short-sighted to not take both of those guys if they couldn't, just kind of based on looking ahead to this roster. Indiana's going to need help in the front court sooner rather than later. Joey Brunk will be moving on after next season. Trace Jackson Davis, we don't necessarily know what he's going to do, but if he has the year, if there is a year, and he has the year that many expect that he could, there's no reason to think that he wouldn't at least test the NBA waters. And Race Thompson, I believe, after this season will be going into his fourth and final year of eligibility. So there's going to be room for guys to come in. They've also obviously already picked up a commitment from Logan Duncombe, but I don't see any reason why they wouldn't want to take Miller and Kaufman if they could get both. Cam, your thoughts on this question? And if you want to chime in with your percentage chances of this happening, feel free, but I'm not touching that one.
Yeah, I'm pretty bad with numbers as well. I mean, I was a journalism and Spanish major, so we're just going to not touch the number on this one. But, I mean, I agree kind of exactly with what you said. You especially look at the way that Indiana prioritized maybe the backcourt with its 2020 recruiting class as well, especially once you get Khristian Lander to reclassify. You obviously know that front court help is going to be needed because right now you are kind of looking at Race Thompson probably being the anchor of that front court. You know, if things do fall into place and Trace Jackson Davis were to have a good enough year to enter the professional ranks and Jerry Brink would have exhausted his eligibility. And you also kind of look at the style of play for maybe those three guys in the front court in the 2021 class. Kaufman kind of maybe more of a further out perimeter player, which is the same kind of way that Miller plays as well. And then you have Duncombe, who's trying to add some more versatility to his game in terms of taking shots from deeper out, but still only attempted, I think, 6 3-pointers as a junior. I think he made like half of them, which is great for that in terms of progression, but he's not going to be necessarily a deep threat from the perimeter or a guy that can space the floor in the way that Kaufman and Miller can, which probably should be a good thing from an IU perspective, just because they're in such good position with Kaufman. And as you mentioned, putting a really good effort on trying to recruit Miller, that even if they end up with only one of those two players, you're going to have kind of a nice yin-yang, vice versa, complementary piece to go with kind of more of an anchor around the basket in Duncombe. But there really should be no objection to getting two of those pieces, especially given the way that the roster composition looks like it'll shake out and maybe the lack of dipping into the transfer market this offseason that we thought they may have given the scholarship situation as well.
Absolutely. IU grad Mark is up next on the mailbag, and Cam, I'll let you kind of address some of these first if you'd like. He has 3 questions. I think a lot of them kind of fit together, but we can kind of take them one at a time, and we can both give some thoughts. First, he wants to know, do you think there will be a pre-conference schedule or just conference games like football is doing? This is with regards to college basketball. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I really don't think there should be, and I don't necessarily think there will be. I mean, I know that there's obviously been some contractual agreements already entered into. I mean, some of his later questions that we'll get into also concern, tournaments like the Maui Invitational and things like that. But just looking from a pre-conference schedule standpoint and some of the bye games that Indiana has, NJIT coming to Bloomington to open the season, Nebraska Omaha, Robert Morris coming here in later December. I just don't necessarily see how the powers at B would kind of allow for something like that to occur without any kind of regulations or a quarantine type setting. Because, and I kind of want to hit on the football aspect of this as well, because I did cover IU football for 3 years and I did kind of follow it pretty closely when the Big Ten did announce that they would go to a conference schedule only for football this fall, if there is football this fall. And one of the critiques of that was the fact that, okay, you're telling me that Indiana shouldn't be allowed to host Western Kentucky for a game, yet they're still going to be allowed to go travel and play Rutgers. And you kind of look at the mathematics of that, the distance traveled, some of those things don't necessarily add up. But why the Big Ten did that in large part was because you can kind of put all these conference teams under one jurisdiction, implement uniform health and safety protocols, implement travel protocols, things that maybe might not be the same when you do cross-conference games and things like that. It's about the oversight, being able to regulate conditions, things like that. And even just when you look at the way the COVID-19 pandemic has affected this country, different states have different levels of success. I think it was just a day or two ago, Indiana was added to the quarantine list so that visitors from Indiana, when they go to New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, they're required to quarantine for 14 days. And you maybe kind of look at the reverse of that, if NJIT is coming to Bloomington to play, I just don't see how maybe a quote-unquote non-essential game like that largely won't have an impact on a team's ability to make the NCAA tournament or make or break their season can kind of go forward in that way.
Yeah, I agree with mostly everything you said there. The thing about it is from just a sheer numbers perspective, you look at the Big Ten, there's 14 schools. It's a lot easier to bring 14 schools under the same kind of rules and regulations for testing and protocols than it is schools like Nebraska Omaha Robert Morris, NJIT, any non-conference game from a low to mid-major school. Those institutions are scraping to get by right now. They're cutting sports, they're cutting resources, they're in trouble, I think, financially if some of these games don't play. However, they're going to have a hard time keeping up with the major conferences in terms of being able to test and do things like that. So from a Big Ten perspective, why would you want to, or any major conference for that matter, why would you want to introduce yourself to more risk when the testing and the protocols aren't apples to apples for these different schools? Now, the one thing I will say is we are sitting here, it's July 22nd. A lot has changed in our world in the last 4 months, and we are, a little bit less than 4 months from when the season would actually start. If it was going to start on time, a lot can change. Things can happen in terms of medicine, vaccines, things like that. We don't have any idea, though, what's going to happen. So I agree with Cam that I just don't think it's trending in the right direction to have a pre-conference schedule at this point. But Mark's second question, do you think the games will be played with fans in attendance? And I can speak to this a little bit first, and Cam, you can kind of give your thoughts. But at this point, I would have to say no, based on everything we know right now. The NBA is not playing right now with fans in attendance. And the NBA is, obviously the highest league of the highest level of basketball in this country. If it were safe to have fans in attendance, the amount of money that the NBA is losing by not having those fans in attendance is exponential. So I don't see any way that until professional sports are opening up the gates with some regularity to have fans, that you're going to see it happen with any kind of large numbers in college sports. So that's kind of where I'm at right now on it. Again, with the caveat that things can change in terms of medicine and resources by the time the season's supposed to start. But as of right now, I'm kind of on the operating under the assumption that fans will not be in attendance. Cam?
Yeah, and you even just look at the way college basketball is played, it's not necessarily conducive to having fans. We've seen some sports in the United States resume with fans. There's been a couple NASCAR races with socially distanced fans. The Indianapolis 500 just announced they'd be at about 25% capacity, which I think at its max would be like 87,000 fans. But again, you're talking about racetracks, very large venue, open air, kind of a lot easier to socially distance and spread out and take precautions than a basketball arena, which is enclosed. Some of these smaller schools in particular, maybe only have a gym that fits a couple thousand people. And also a lot of these schools play on campus as well. So you're inviting people in from an outside environment who, just like we mentioned, the Big Ten instituting oversight for testing protocols for teams. If you have someone driving from, Cleveland, Ohio to go watch an IU game, you're introducing someone into that environment that hasn't been under the same procedures that, coaches, players, probably media members as well, perhaps would have to undergo. And also just maybe kind of from just a fair play standpoint, I'm not sure how you could have one league play with fans or schools in one league play with fans and then another league with no fans, or a different school in that same league playing with no fans. I mean, I look at maybe the SEC for an example. If you look at Georgia, if they allow fans to go watch Tom Crean's Bulldogs play, but there's something saying that Texas A&M can't have fans in College Station, that would probably create a bit of an unequal playing field. And just from all standpoints, it would seem easier just to kind of block it all off to fans in all ways, even if that is, maybe taking a bit of the life out of the sport. It is for everyone's health and safety at the end of the day.
Third question from Mark. He asks if there's a pre-conference season, what happens to things like Maui? And do they get canceled, placed somewhere else or other? We've already kind of seen we've seen some dominoes fall in regard to that. I believe the Cancun event, or maybe the Grand Cayman Islands, one of them that Purdue was supposed to be playing in. I'm not sure exactly which one it was. I think it's been moved to Florida already. So there's not going to be that's not going to be at the original spot that it was supposed to be. And I was talking, I've talked to a couple of people the last couple of days, and none of them think that something like Maui is going to happen at this point. I just don't see the upside for 8 schools flying. Basically, it's a full day of travel, depending on where you're coming from, to go to a place to play games, especially if there's not going to be fans there. That's that's an event that's basically held as a vacation type event for fans of different schools to go to. And I don't see there being much of an appetite for people to travel to that event. So I don't know if they get canceled or moved back. That is going to depend on whether or not there is non-conference games this year. But I just can't see them, something like Battle for Atlantis, Maui. I just can't see those things kind of taking place business as usual at this point.
Yeah, you were right on it's the Cancun Challenge that got moved to Florida about a week ago that Purdue was involved in. I think just from a structural standpoint, something like the Maui Invitational would have a better chance of occurring than just these random non-conference games, just because you have your field set and you can maybe isolate them or do some kind of an NBA type bubble environment to make sure that teams arrive at a location, quarantine, and then get through the playing of the event safely. But to, for example, I mean, just the fact of flying at Hawaii for it, when you said it's kind of treated as a vacation and, a reward in sorts for the school, boosters who travel with the team, players, fans, their families, things like that. I don't think it makes sense to do that, but I think you could have a better chance of replicating it, whether it's moving to a place in the continental United States or just something that kind of keeps them in that controlled environment. Because I do think that does have a better chance of succeeding, though, if you give the teams the appropriate amount of time before and after the event to isolate themselves and go through whatever kind of testing procedures the event can afford. But from the standpoint of, at least traveling to Maui, packing into a convention center for a week, or I think it's usually during Feast Week on Thanksgiving when they have that event, it just doesn't seem to make sense in its current setup. And also, you mentioned the smaller schools as well. This is kind of a double-edged sword for them, because you maybe look at a school like Davidson, which probably leans a bit more heavily than Indiana on its basketball revenue and then playing on these marquee showpiece events. I'm sure they would want to go forward with it because bringing in the money is so integral to funding the rest of their athletic department. But if these events get canceled, they wouldn't be able to continue with it. So I think the participation and the desire to do it is still there. It's just about doing it in the safest way possible, and that probably doesn't involve a full day of travel to Hawaii for no good reason.
Our next question comes from Piano Roark. I think I'm saying this correctly. He asks, he or she, I'm not sure exactly, but what's your projection for what the NCAA tournament will look like? Many low and mid-major schools won't have much of a chance to secure at-large bids as in a normal year because the competition will be relegated to their sometimes less than stellar in-conference opponents. Will the NCAA cut the tourney down to 32 teams, conference winners only, something else altogether? I think to speculate on this at this point is basically just kind of throwing darts at the wall. We have no idea what it'll look like. What I can tell you is, based on some conversations that I've had in the last 2 weeks, there is a strong desire from within the NCAA to make sure they have the NCAA tournament next year in some form or format. It was a major financial loss to the NCAA to not have March Madness last year. It's a lot different for basketball than it is football because the NCAA does not control the bowl games. They do not control the college football playoff, but they do control March Madness and the TV contracts and all the money that they receive from that. To not have that for 2 straight years could be a big problem for the NCAA. So I think they're going to do whatever they can to have it, whether it's March Madness, whether it's May Madness, whether it's June Madness, whatever they can figure out to have a tournament. I think they're going to do everything in their power. As for what it will look like, I think most of us can agree that cover the sport and follow it, that we don't really care what it looks like. If it's only 32 teams, so be it. If it's expanded to try to get to overcompensate for maybe not having as many opportunities for non-conference teams to get a bid. I think people that follow college basketball, that are fans of the sport, just want to see the tournament in some format. They know that this isn't a long-term thing, but they just want to see the tournament played. So that's kind of, I don't mean to, there's several questions in there that I don't think that we can really answer in terms of what it'll look like. I just think that we are hopeful that there is some kind of tournament. And I also want to just kind of reiterate the fact that I think there is going to be a strong preference from the NCAA to try to have the tournament in some form, shape or form. Otherwise, it could be a huge problem for them moving forward from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, and I guess kind of when you talk about, the potential of any losing at-large teams if it did go down to 32 or whatever, while that would affect maybe one or two of the brighter mid-majors or lower schools that, had a particularly good year and maybe stumbled in the semifinals or final of their conference tournament, that would also eliminate a large chunk of just the major conference teams. I mean, you look at the Big Ten getting 6-7 teams into a tournament. Same thing with the ACC, even the multiple teams that sometimes get in from the Pac-12. This would change a lot of things for a lot of schools, although those bigger schools probably would be able to weather it a bit better. But I do think what would be interesting to see is just in whatever format that March Madness does take place in, how many conferences maybe would call an audible and just send their regular season champion, because them being the best representative of the conference, ensuring that, maybe the MAC or the Sun Belt has a better chance to spring an upset or two during whatever kind of March Madness we have compared to, maybe a 6 seed that would go through the conference tournament and win for one of those leagues. So it'd be interesting to see just if any schools kind of, call an audible on the fly like that just to try and get the very best representative from their school in there. But then again, if the tournament did expand to, 15, 20 more teams, that may not even be something that is too much of a concern to them.
Follow up here. What's your preference for what the NCAA should do with the tournament if pre-conference schedules are cut? What do you think is most fair to players and coaches, most exciting for fans of the sport? Cam, I'll let you go first on this if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm actually going on a wild tangent here real quick, because this was something I was very passionate about when reading this question you told me you were going to discuss today. So for anyone who knows me, I'm a huge soccer fan, huge European soccer fan. My dad's from Scotland, mom's from Brazil, followed the sport my whole life, all that stuff. So if you're able to have a fully played out conference schedule in the league, 20 games for the Big Ten, 18 games for the ACC, whatever it may be, I wouldn't mind like a coefficient type rating created by the NCAA, which is something you see in European soccer to determine Champions League places. So, for example, you would take all of the leagues that exist in Division I basketball, you'd rank them based on certain metrics, maybe KenPom, maybe AP poll votes, maybe some kind of mixture of a bunch of different things. And based on that, you would give a certain amount of teams automatic entry into the NCAA tournament based on their regular season finish in the league, with the better leagues getting more teams, kind of just like an at-large system would work. So, for example, you could say the top 4 finishers in the regular season in the Big Ten automatically qualify for the tournament. Maybe only the regular season champion in like the Atlantic Sun qualifies for the tournament. And then if you're allowed to safely have conference tournaments as well, that's a chance for the schools who didn't make that cutoff to kind of run the table and steal a spot and get an extra berth for the league and make the NCAA tournament that way. And then just like the NCAA tournament functions now, you would take those lesser teams that spring upsets in the conference tournament and you'd play them in an opening round, first 4 qualification type thing. And then kind of from there, you'd go off and have the NCAA tournament as normal. I think that'd be the most fair, because you're rewarding teams for having a strong regular season campaign without maybe getting to the subjective nature of the tournament committee because of whatever non-conference games are eliminated. But you're also still allowing each team a chance to sneak into the tournament just as they would normally via their conference tournaments, and kind of just have as best a simulated NCAA tournament as you can, given the factors of, okay, maybe NJIT can't come to Bloomington and steal a win, and that would get people's attention or something like that.
I like the outside of the box thinking. I would say I don't want to see the tournament cut down to 32 teams. I don't want to see it change from what it is, which is, I believe, 68 when you consider the first 4. I think if you can play 32, you can play 64. It's just one more game for everybody. I would like to see basically, if you're not going to have conference tournaments, which if you're going to have the NCAA tournament, I would think you're going to have conference tournaments at that point. But I would like to see the leagues kind of figure out whatever they feel is best in terms of giving the automatic qualifier to the conference tournament or the regular season champion. But the one adjustment I would like to see is maybe a limit placed on at-large bids for the major conferences, so that there has to be a certain number of mid-major or lower major teams get into the tournament to kind of offset them not being able to have the opportunities to kind of earn wins in non-conference play to bolster their resumes. I think that would be a fair way to do it. If the Big Ten had a problem with that and they were going to get 10 or 11, well, if you can't finish, in my mind, if you can't finish, top 6, 7, 8 in your league, and you're the 11th place Big Ten team and you're going to be in the first 4, then sorry about your luck, but we're going to let in a low major or mid major in your place. So that's kind of really my only thought on it. I would hope that they could have it at least in its the same amount of teams, the same formatting. I do think there may have to be considerations for venues and kind of timing of when it happens. Maybe you see something like a 7 to 10 day quarantine before it starts, teams arriving at sites and kind of doing that thing. We did see, I think the one thing that we're seeing right now that's very encouraging from the COVID standpoint is the basketball tournament went on. It was in one spot. And if you followed it at all, at the beginning, teams were starting to get weeded out because they were having positive tests, whether that be at home before the teams came there, and then early on in the bubble, they threw some teams out that had positive tests. But by the end, there was no positive test because everyone had quarantined and stayed inside the bubble, and so everyone was able to continue playing. The same thing we're seeing with the NBA. When before everyone traveled to Orlando, there was a lot of positive tests. There was guys who had to quarantine that arrived late, but I believe the NBA announced the other day that 346 tests have been conducted, and there were 0 positives. So that proves to me that this can work, and as many resources as it might take to pull off an NCAA tournament with a similar setup, I do think that there would be an appetite for it. I think there would be a reason to try to pursue it because I just don't think, for college basketball standpoint, and obviously health and safety of everybody has to be the ultimate goal of all of this for all of us. But I just don't know that the sport, it's going to be tough to recover from having 2 straight years of not naming a champion or having that. That's the big thing. There's a lot of, obviously, Indiana fans follow the sport year round. It's one of the maybe 5 to 10 schools in the country that's like that. The rest of the country, they tune in for March Madness and conference tournaments for those 3 or 4 weeks a year, and that's it. It's a seasonal sport for them. So as someone who loves college basketball, as someone who wants to see it thrive and continue to succeed, I'm hopeful that we'll figure out a way to get a tournament next year because I just worry about the long-term viability of the sport if there is not a tournament. We've got, I think, 2 more there are 2 more groups of questions here that we'll get to before we get out of here. Swish from the forum, he writes that there's been a lot of discussion about the breakout possibilities for Jerome Hunter, Armand Franklin, and Race Thompson. Dylan Wallace wrote that piece on Inside the Hall. Swish says all 3 are valid possibilities, and I know that we would all like to see this happen. I view this coming season as a real breakout possibility for Rob Phinisee as well. It seems as though he has been held back by injuries that could really, and this could be really a season where he excels. I feel like playing with Khristian Lander will only help him this season. How do you view this? I would say, and Cam, you can chime in with your thoughts as well. I would say I think Khristian Lander and Rob Phinisee are going to be able to play a lot together. I don't think it's going to be a situation where one of them plays 22 minutes a game and the other plays 18. I think they're going to be able to be on the court together because they can both score the ball. I think Lander's obviously probably a bigger threat to score, but I think Phinisee is a better shooter than he's shown to this point. I think he can improve a lot in that area, and I'm optimistic that those 2 will be able to coexist. Now, against some teams that maybe have a little bit more size in the backcourt, it may be harder to pull off because both of them are smaller guys, and there could be some mismatches. Fumbling my words there for a second, but I think they can. I think they can work together. I think they can play together, and I do think it's a big year coming up for Rob Phinisee. He's got to be. I don't remember who it was. I think it was Jeff Goodman. I had him on the podcast 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he talked about, teams that are really good in college basketball have 2 capable point guards. And so Indiana has a chance to have that this year with both of those guys. So I feel like having a guy like Lander on the team can only help Rob Phinisee. I don't view it as a negative in any way for him.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, of course, the thing with Rob that's kind of held him back the most hasn't necessarily been his teammates or the scheme or anything. It's just been his health. It's whether he's, had a rolled ankle, problems with his hamstring or a concussion or something like that. He's just never been able to kind of piece together the entirety of a season where he's been feeling good and performing consistently, probably in part due to those injuries. And I think when you kind of enter Khristian Lander into the discussion, it's not necessarily an or situation between him and Phinisee. It's more of an and. It's more of a complementary thing. If you look at, minutes from a player diminishing because of Lander's arrival, I don't think Rob Phinisee is in that discussion. You probably pivot to Armaan Franklin or maybe even Al Durham coming off the bench if you didn't want to go with a 3-guard lineup. So I think Rob and Khristian will play together a lot. And as you mentioned, they're both capable of scoring the ball. Rob maybe with a little bit more of a facilitator aspect to him than Khristian does. But there shouldn't be necessarily a roadblock or a problem with them being able to share the court, share minutes together, especially as Lander kind of works his way into the rotation. Again, it's kind of yet to be seen if he'll have those maybe softer non-conference games to get more acclimated to college basketball. But I think having Rob, continue to be primary ball handler, Lander as a young player learning his way through the game, playing probably at the 2 and getting some shots in and working in tandem with Rob should be the ideal situation for Indiana.
Final question, our set of questions for this week's mailbag. Thanks everybody again in the forum for submitting their questions. I know there was a couple we didn't include, but I tried to kind of take some of the ones that kind of flowed together here, so we weren't all over the place. But Frails, 2-parter. First part, Cam, you can take this first because I didn't see Khristian Lander play in person this season. I only saw a video, but he asks, do you think Khristian Lander can hang in there on defense? I've watched a lot of video, but it's hard for me to translate that to college.
Yeah, so just based on my personal experiences watching him play a couple times and also speaking with Michael Adams, who was his high school coach at Evansville Rights, and even some people in the Indiana Elite program where he played AAU ball, his speed is kind of what stands out for his ability to hang in there on defense. I mean, yes, he's a 17-year-old kid who just reclassified, so he's not going to be quite as strong. He's not going to have quite that physicality. Those are things you learn by translating to the college game in general. But in particular for him, he's going to have to get in there with Marshall in the weight room and put in the work to bulk up and be strong and big enough to handle some of the Big Ten's better guards. But his speed is what's going to allow him to stay in front of guys, especially if he stays focused on defense, doesn't take possessions off. He's going to be able to, put himself in between the ball and the basket. He's going to be able to hustle back when the other team has a fast break opportunity. So from that standpoint, he should be able, at least from a speed standpoint, shouldn't have too many problems containing some of the Big Ten's smaller, quicker guards either. And especially when we talk about him playing with Rob Phinisee being probably the best on-ball defender over the past couple of years at IU, and certainly now with Justin Smith's transfer, I think that may take a bit of pressure off Khristian as well from being, elite level defender from day one, and can allow him to, mold himself into the pack line system a bit. And especially because if his growth and if his potential does translate in the way it should, he shouldn't have a problem after a couple months or a year in the weight room of having his physicality match his speed and being able to play adequate defense, especially in tandem with Phinisee.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. And the other thing I'll kind of add on as another point to that is he's going to play defense, or he's not going to have the role that he wants on the team, because that's what Archie Miller and this Indiana coaching staff emphasize and what they demand of their players. And the program is now entering his 4th season to the point where there's enough depth on this roster to where the bench can be used maybe a little bit more as a motivator than it has been able to in the past. We've seen situations the past 3 years where certain guys just had to play out of necessity because there wasn't really another option. But now you look at this roster and you see Khristian Lander, you see Rob Phinisee, you see Armaan Franklin, you see Al Durham, Trey Galloway, Anthony Leal, kind of go down the list. And if something's not working, you try somebody else. And that's kind of how I think the situation has to be viewed, and I think he's going to have to hang in there. Is there going to be times where he struggles because he is a younger guy trying to adapt to a level of basketball that's a lot more competitive and physical and demanding than what he saw last year? Absolutely, but I think he's talented enough to make it work. Is it going to be perfect? Is it going to be an all-league defender from the beginning? Probably not, but he's good enough, I think, in other areas to kind of compensate for that, and he's going to be too talented to keep off the floor, but he's going to have to work defensively to earn a role and keep it. That's my opinion. Last question from Frails. If we don't have a season this year, how do you think that will affect everything next year with our roster? I can take that first, Cam, and you can chime in if you have any follow-up thoughts. I think the most straightforward answer we can give you is we don't know. If we don't have a season, I think it opens up the possibility of guys obviously leaving, like a Trace Jackson Davis, depending on what the climate looks like with the NBA and the G League. Obviously, the NBA has been a little bit more aggressive now with kind of getting guys into the G League and offering deals. You would think if there's no season, there's going to be more guys that are interested in that option, because if they can't play in college, they want to play somewhere, and that path will be made available to them. And I think the two guys that kind of stick out as a possibility to do something like that, if it happened, are the guys who are the most talented on the roster, which is Trace Jackson Davis and Khristian Lander. So I think everybody's crossing their fingers that the season is going to happen and that those guys are going to get to suit up for Indiana. But if it doesn't happen, then I don't think anything's off the table in terms of uncertainty. It would be obviously an unfortunate situation because Archie Miller has really kind of built this thing up to where he's going to have the pieces in place to have a really successful team. It kind of feels like that this has kind of been building towards this one season. So it'd be a shame to see that taken away from the program to have that chance to play. But, at some point, if there's not that opportunity to play, I think a lot of these guys are going to have to assess their options and see kind of what the best path forward is to them, because, just like any other student who's kind of high level in their field, if you came to school as a business student and all of a sudden you couldn't go to business school anymore and a job was available and they said, well, just go ahead and bypass that. We think you're talented enough to come work for our business. You probably would go ahead and take that opportunity. The same thing holds true for these guys who are the top level in basketball, that ultimately they aspire to play in the NBA. I had somebody tell me recently, one thing that's different for Archie now being the coach at Indiana than it was at Dayton is every player he recruits to Indiana thinks they're an NBA player. They're not all, but that's the mentality of a lot of these guys, and they want to get to that next level. So the guys who are actually are able to achieve that goal, I think, a lost season for them is really going to, put some pressure on them in terms of their decision making and try to figure out what their next move was. I just don't see it. It's not just going to be Indiana, but there would be a lot of kids, I feel like, if there was no season, that are just going to go ahead and move on and pursue professional opportunities, whether it be in the NBA, whether it be in the G League, or even overseas, because if they're not given that opportunity to play in college, they're going to find it elsewhere.
Yeah, and you kind of look at when this whole coronavirus pandemic began and the NCAA began to have to take action with regard to it in March, you saw maybe the way that they tried to grant seniors an extra year for sports like baseball and softball, and the way that they're going to have expanded rosters for this upcoming baseball and softball season to accommodate for that. And that's yet to be seen how that would work with the scholarship situation in college basketball. And I think it kind of goes more into also some of the complexities of it as well. For example, if there's not going to be any competitive games, or you're still allowed to play exhibitions or, put stuff on film that you can show to draft scouts or people who think that you might work into a G League system right away, would you still have access to team facilities and a weight room, in addition to just working with personal trainers like so many guys do? But like you said, it's going to definitely impact things in the way that a lot of guys may not want to sit around and wait another year, because, going to college to play high-level athletics is an investment in yourself, just like going to college for a specific degree path is an investment in yourself. And the moment when you're ready to enter the working field and make money, make real money from what you're doing, then you need to take that every chance you get. And, for a lot of guys, as you mentioned, not just Indiana, whether it's incoming freshmen or second or third year guys, if, the system as it be deems that they're ready or tells them that they're ready to make the next leap, then a lot of guys are going to take that opportunity, even more than we just see now from guys bypassing the college system entirely and entering the G League pathway to the NBA program.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody who submitted questions this week. It was a lot of fun to open, I guess, the virtual mailbag. I don't know why we call it a mailbag, because it's not like I actually go out and open the inside the hall mailbag at my house and pull these questions out. But I guess that's just a fun way of putting it and what we've always said. But a lot of fun to tackle these questions. Cam, I'm glad you were able to join us to do so. Thanks for all the work that you've continued to do at Inside the Hall. Cam and I right now, with Dylan moving on to an opportunity with Sports Illustrated Indiana, we're kind of keeping the ship afloat, him more than me right now. So Cam, thanks for that. And again, as I said at the top of the show, drop Cam an email, a DM if you want to hire him. He's looking for work. And I think you're going to be heading back to Texas here soon? When's that happening?
Yeah, my lease in my place here in Bloomington ends in about 2.5 weeks from today, recording on July 22nd. So before I know it, I guess I'll be back in the Lone Star State. Looking forward to eating some Whataburger. Looking forward
Canes
to
regularly.
Well, I'm looking forward to on the way down. I think I'm going to drive through Louisville intentionally just to pick up Canes on my way back home. So a lot of good food opportunities on the horizon for me. But yes, I would like a source of income to also kind of substantiate those food opportunities. So if you want me to continue eating patty melts from Whataburger and Caniacs from Raising Cane's, please pay me to cover your local sports team. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. We may or may not be back next week. We're kind of on an irregular schedule at this point. Kind of depends on what happens in terms of IU basketball. If there's any news or anything relevant that we feel should be discussed, we'll probably try to hit a more regular schedule when we get back into the fall and the semester starts back up for students and things like that. But for now, we may see you next week. We may not. But thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. Remember to join me and my co-hosts for more IU basketball talk at assemblycall.com and visit Alex over at insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana basketball. If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.